Hi everybody, I am Ann Urok and I'm here to talk about our final module for this class, which is our case study. So to summarize the case that we were given, the principal had been working hard in order to complete and submit teacher evaluations. Overall, he was fairly pleased with the current group of teachers except one teacher, Mrs. Stevens. When the principal visited her classroom for an evaluation, he could immediately see that she was having difficulty in her classroom with keeping students on task and invested in their learning. The principal didn't doubt her content knowledge, but struggling with her classroom management. Next, the principal had a post-visitation meeting with Mrs. Stevens. During the meeting, Mrs. Stevens was irritable and uncommunicative and defensive during anything that the principal said. She claimed that the students clammed up every time the principal came in the room. The principal ended the meeting without any progress being made, then came to the conclusion that he needed to revisit Mrs. Stevens' classroom one more time before deciding on her renewal or not. The next week, the principal went back to Mrs. Stevens' classroom where there was little improvement and the same classroom management problems as before. After the end of the class period, the principal decided to recommend the non-renewal of Mrs. Stevens. He completed the teacher evaluation for Mrs. Stevens, stating the inadequacies at which she has. The principal and Mrs. Stevens had another meeting about the second evaluation. The principal showed Mrs. Stevens the evaluation form. She quickly looked at it and threw it back on the principal's desk, declaring that the evaluation was inaccurate and did not deserve the low rating. Angrily, Mrs. Stevens told the principal she didn't know anything about teaching her class and that the principal hasn't helped her develop any ideas on how to improve or received any supervision to help her. Mrs. Stevens left the principal's office unhappy, telling the principal that she plans to put up a fight against the poor rating that could lead to a non-renewal that could then lead to court being involved. So next we have if there's any legal or ethical issues involved. So Mrs. Stevens could be harmed by the recommendation of the principal will make about non-renewing her. The situation doesn't contravene any existing laws since the principal performed a formal evaluation on Mrs. Stevens. The only breach of contract there could be is the principal not providing or developing any type of support towards an action plan for Mrs. Stevens to improve on student engagement and classroom management. Next, we were asked to synthesize. So the principal evaluated in Mrs. Stevens' classroom where he saw low student involvement and poor class management, leading to a poor evaluation, and the principal gave her second chance on an evaluation before he made his decision on her renewal. Then, when she heard of her bad evaluation, she was angered and told the principal she was going to fight this. Next, we're going to synthesize the facts that we were given. So the people that were involved. So the principal is conducting the evaluations on his teachers. He came to a snag when Mrs. Stevens was underperforming in her student engagement and classroom management. Next is the place, so what places were involved in the situation. So the events happened in two different places in the school, one of the places being Mrs. Stevens' classroom and the other place being the principal's office. The last thing on here is program. So the program would be the principal is submitting teacher evaluations by using a teacher evaluation form, which I have included the teacher evaluation form that we were provided in the scenario. So review and prioritize the information that we were given. So the only type of damage that could occur to the stakeholders would be the principal passing on his opinion on the evaluation of Mrs. Stevens to his superior or the superintendent. Next, the individuals that have an important stake in the decision of Mrs. Stevens' renewal depend upon the principal on what the principal turns into the superintendent based on what he evaluated in the classroom. In the process so far in the system of evaluating, all of the stakeholders have been consulted until the principal passes on the evaluation form to his superior. I think there could be some more information told. For instance, if the principal had done any informal observations or walkthroughs before the actual evaluation for Mrs. Stevens, this would allow the principal to see more of Mrs. Stevens' classroom outside the formal evaluations. Lastly, I think that more information could be acquired in order to make a final decision on her renewal. This could mean getting different kinds of evaluations besides a formal evaluation to see what Mrs. Stevens looks like when it is not a formal evaluation. So the next slide here is where we identify our options and possible consequences. So I listed out 3 options here and the possible consequences. So the first option I have is submit the current evaluation form to the superintendent/superior with your opinion on the non-renewal of Mrs. Stevens and accept the repercussions that could happen if Mrs. Stevens fights the evaluation if she doesn't get renewed. Option 2 would be talk to the superintendent to have him come evaluate Mrs. Stevens to see if they witness the same thing that the principal did. Then they together can make a decision on the renewal of Mrs. Stevens or not. And the last option on here is the principal can call Mrs. Stevens back into his office and develop together an action plan for her. The principal should help guide her to help her with student engagement and classroom management. It should include informal and walkthrough evaluations, in her classroom, possibly even adding a mentor teacher to help as well. Then, if Mrs. Stevens doesn't comply or fails to work through the action plan, the principal and superior will have to have an easier decision to make. And the possible consequences could be getting legal allegations involved if the situation goes as is and Mrs. Stevens fights against her non-renewal. Another possible consequence could be that the administrators and Mrs. Stevens creating the action plan and Mrs. Stevens doesn't comply to it. So on our next slide here, we are going to evaluate our options. So I have them listed out in the pros and cons and according to each option. So under option 1, the principal gave Mrs. Stevens a second chance is a pro. Another pro would be it's followed a normal evaluation system. Under option 2, a pro would be it lets the superior or the superintendent see the classroom for themselves to help with the decision being made. And for option 3, some of the pros would be that allows the action plan for Mrs. Stevens to improve, adds more to the evaluation system, and that it creates actionable feedback for both sides. Has the possibility of adding a mentor teacher to the process. There's more check-ins in the classroom from the principal, and then it benefits both the school and the students in the end. So some cons that I listed out for each of the options. Option 1, there could be some legality issues since Mrs. Stevens said she was going to fight against the non-renewal. It doesn't really promote the school improvement or student success in the end. Option 2 still only uses formal evaluations as the entire evaluation system. And then option 3, Mrs. Stevens may not follow through on the action plan would be our con. So choosing the best option of the ones that I described, I would choose option 3. This option will allow the principal and Mrs. Stevens to develop an action plan to help her improve on her student engagement and classroom management. It would give Mrs. Stevens a chance to work on what the principal had identified as lacking in her classroom. The action plan should consist of workshops, informal evaluations, walkthroughs throughout the action plan time or duration, and plus adding a mentor teacher can help guide Mrs. Stevens as well, which is someone besides the principal giving her ideas. It will give the principal a chance to also to work on their actionable feedback and create action plans for his teachers in the future from their evaluations. I think this decision will be put in the right dialogue in order to get Mrs. Stevens on board with the action plan. I think it would be a beneficial way to help a teacher get a chance to improve on their skills to ensure that they are in the right profession and ensuring student success. I also think that the superior superintendent will need to be involved with what the principal is implementing to make sure that they have their back and can help create the action plan for Mrs. Stevens. This can help Mrs. Stevens improve on her classroom management skills and student engagement and the success within her classroom. It can also be used as a guide in the future for an action plan system if needed for other teachers. So choosing my path for implementing my decision. So step 1 here, I have communicate with your superior superintendent about what happened previously and what your current plan is to help Mrs. Stevens. Step 2 would be develop possible ideas for the action plan with the superintendent beforehand. Step 3 would be call Mrs. Stevens back to the principal's office to discuss the current plan of action. Step 4 would be with all 3 stakeholders, including Mrs. Stevens, the principal, and the superintendent, develop a full action plan for the future to improve in the classroom. And then step 5, we have explained to Mrs. Stevens that she will need to work through the action plan in order to show her dedication to be renewed. And then step 6 would be implement and start the action plan. And step 7 would be the principal would need to execute walkthroughs and informal and formal evaluations throughout the duration of the action plan. Step 8, the principal will have feedback meetings with Mrs. Stevens about how the process is going and use it as a check-in to see how she is doing. Step 9, which is the last one, at the end of the allotted time for the action plan, review Mrs. Stevens' progress to determine her renewal or not. So continuing on with implementing my decision. So what may happen here is an outcome that could possibly happen could be Mrs. Stevens is unreceptive or refuses the action plan. This then could lead to the consequence of her not being renewed, then leading to possible legal issues being taken by her. Who needs to know? The superior superintendent will need to be a part of the process in creating an action plan and making sure that it is being implemented effectively. And then next, can I deal with this on my own? Yes, I think I'd be able to deal with this, deal with working through the action plan with Mrs. Stevens. It would come to the point if Mrs. Stevens rejects the action plan or fails to complete it, then the superintendent would need to get involved and make a final decision on renewing Mrs. Stevens. Warn, don't threaten. So if the situation doesn't go according to the plan, there could be legal actions taken by Mrs. Stevens, but the principal will have to make sure that everything is covered so that nothing too bad would happen to the school if Mrs. Stevens decides to fight the decision. So this is making sure that you have data to back up your final decision in case legal happens. Lastly, what you might do next if the chosen plan of action doesn't work. I think I would choose option 2 as my backup plan if the initial plan doesn't work out as intended. This would allow the superintendent to have a chance to evaluate so Mrs. Stevens to see if he was observing the same thing. So giving myself a little bit of reflection over doing this case study. Throughout my previous classes I've taken so far, this scenario is by far the most challenging when thinking of possible options as a future leader and creating and implementing an action plan for a teacher that could be underperforming. As a principal or any type of administrator, it is never easy and fun to deal with a situation like this. But this case study was a great way to allow me to evaluate, develop, and implement a system for supervision and evaluation. Developing some sort of outline or template for developing an action plan for a future teacher can be key to any evaluator. In the end, for any principal or future evaluator, we want what is best for our students to ensure their success while promoting improvement throughout the school in the end. I learned a lot through this class. I'm excited to see what is next, and thank you for listening.